Irreducible complexity. A Christian chemist I spoke to said irreducible complexity is no longer a strong argument because some proteins have been found to self-order. Comments?
So there was a guy named Michael Behe who came up with this idea of irreducible complexity. He said, well, you can have evolution, but at some point you need room for the work of God and design to do it. And then other people come up with some counter theories and counter evidence to say, no, we've discovered that proteins can self-interlock and break down and form new things. To me, here's the thing about all these scientific questions. When apologists talk about science and they're not scientists, they don't know what they're talking about. I don't know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about science. But here's what I do know. If somebody comes along and says, because evolution is true, therefore Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that's a non sequitur. One has nothing to do with the other. If I'm not convinced of evolution, but if I became convinced of evolution, I might rethink how I interpret Genesis. I won't rethink whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. So there's a huge chasm between the two. I know Christians that work in our seminary who do affirm evolution, and they still affirm Jesus rose from the dead, because no matter what process God used, he's still the creator. So I don't think much about those kind of issues. I understand how people are curious. We live in a science-enamored culture where we look to science to answer more questions than scientists should be allowed to answer because it's way outside of their field. I think science is outside of my field. So I don't try to answer. I've read some of this stuff about irreducible complexity. It's just not something I focus on. If evolution will not be a barrier for me now Jesus didn't rise from the dead because we evolved from some primordial soup. Well, that's God's prerogative. I don't know for sure. I don't personally think so, but to me, it really doesn't matter if this argument about irreducible complexity gets debunked. The track record of science ever figuring a lot of things out is actually kind of bad, and they always change their mind every so often since they started doing science, and I expect that to go on. But the arguments for where I start with is the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so while scientists want to hash that out, I'm going to defend the faith, not arguments for or against evolution.